We continue now at the top of Daf Ayin Dalid and Beis and Meseches Bava Kamma. This is Bava Kamma Daf 74b. On the previous summit, Rabbi Zera begins his question, why don't we say that if a master knocks out the eye of the Eved, so nepuk be'eno, so then he should go free with the knocking out of his eye? Hipel es sheno, let's say he knocks out his tooth, nepuk be'sheno, so then he should go out with the knocking out of his tooth. And sima es eno v'hipel es sheno, and why don't we say that if he blinds him and knocks out his tooth, nepuk be'eno v'sheno, then he should go free with his eye and his tooth? Meaning to say, why should we assume that you have to pay money in a situation where a master knocks out both the tooth and the eye? Maybe that just sets the Eved free, and the Eved is not entitled to any money. We've been assuming all along that the Eved is entitled to the money of the later thing that has been knocked out. And the Gemara says to that, Amar Abaye, Abaye says, Alech Amar Kra, to you the pasuk says, Tachas Eino, it says, instead of his eye, Velo Tachas Eino Vishino. It doesn't say that he goes free because of his eye and his tooth, meaning to say it's only because of one of them. And Tachas Shino, he goes free because of his tooth. Velo Tachas Shino Ve'eno, not because of his tooth and his eye. And that's why we say again that if both are knocked out, the Eved will be entitled to money from the latter one. And the Gemara continues, Amar Ravidi Baravin, Ravidi Baravin says, Af anon nami tanina. We have a Mishnah that says like this as well, meaning to say that this Mishnah is going to prove Hachasha Tchilas Hazama. This is the machlokas between Rava and Abaye. So Ravidi Baravin says, we see it from our Mishnah. Gonav al Pishnaim. What does it say in our Mishnah? If somebody steals, and there are two witnesses, V'tavachu Machar al Piyam, and the same two witnesses say that he slaughtered or he sold the animal, V'nimtzu Zomin, and it turns out that these witnesses are false, Mishalmin lo es hakol. They have to pay everything, meaning to say they have to pay the 4 or 5 times the amount, because that's what they were trying to be mechayiv the defendant. And the Gemara says, my lav is it not? Deheidu ala gneva. First they testify in the fact that he stole. V'chazru v'heidu ala tvicha. And then they go ahead and they testify that he slaughtered. V'huzmu ala gneva. And then they're falsified on the gneva. V'chazru v'huzmu ala tvicha. And then they're falsified on the tvicha, on the slaughtering. V'hakevon shehuzmu ala gneva. And so therefore the Gemara says, from the fact, at the point in time rather, that they're falsified on the stealing, legabe tvicha havelu muchashin. When it comes to the slaughtering, they're really considered contradicted on the slaughtering at that point in time. That's a hachasha. By being falsified on the geneva, there really is no tvicha after a geneva. That's a hachasha. V'katani mishalman lo esakol, and yet it says that when there is a hazama on the tvicha, they have to pay everything. V'isal kadaitach hachasha lav tchilas hazamahi. And if you think that hachasha is not the beginning of hazama, at tvicha my mishalman, why are they paying on the fact that they testified about the slaughtering? El lav shmamino hachasha tchilas hazamahi. Rather, is it not that we see that hachasha is the beginning of hazama, like Rava said? And the Gemara responds, Amri, the sages say, Hacha b'may askinan. Here, what is the case in our Mishnah? Kagon shehuzmu ala tvicha tchila. What's actually happening is they were first falsified about their testimony about the tvicha and the slaughtering, and therefore you have no proof that hachasha is tchilas hazama. And the Gemara notes, Uveplugsa edim shehuchshu levasof huzmu, Rabbi Yochanan v'Rebbe Elazar. This machlokus between Abaye and Rava, when you have Edom that are contradicted first and then they're falsified, that's also a machlokus between Rabbi Yochanan and Rebbe Elazar. Chad Amar Neharagin, one of them says that in such a situation the Edom are killed, meaning it is considered a hazama. The Chad Amar Ein Neharagin, and one says they are not killed, it's not considered a hazama, meaning the machlokus Abaye and Rava is also machlokus Rabbi Yochanan and Rebbe Elazar. And the Gemara says, Testaim the Rebbe Elazar hu the Amar Ein Neharagin, we should conclude that Rebbe Elazar is the one that says they are not killed, that it's not considered a hazama. The Amar Rebbe Elazar, because Rebbe Elazar says, Edom shehuchshu nefesh lokin. If Edom are contradicted when it comes to a situation of nefashos, they get malchus. Now, if you think that Rebbe Elazar holds that they get killed, amai lokin, so why would they get malchus? Meaning to say, let's say you have Edom that say that Ruvain killed Shimon and Ruvain is chayiv, dina nefashos, Ruvain is chayiv to be killed. And then those Edom are contradicted. So then we say that those Edom essentially lied, they get malchus for false testimony. But now, if it's true that Rebbe Elazar says that if they would later have a hazama, they would be killed, that's what it means. If it's Rebbe Elazar that says hachasha tchilas hazama, and if there were to be a hazama, they would be killed. Amai loken, why would they get malchus on the hachasha, on the contradiction? Havale lav shenitan lazharas misas bezin. It would be essentially a violation of a lav that is given over for a warning that could lead to a misas bezdin. That's called the lav shenitan lazharas misas bezin, and there's a rule. V'chol lav shenitan lazharas misas bezin. Anytime you have a lav that's given over to capital punishment to misas bezdin, ein loken olav Yaakov, there is no malchus. Rather, don't we see that Rebbe Elazar is the one that holds they don't get killed, there would not be a hazama here, there would not be kasher zamam, and that's why it's possible to get malchus. And the Gemara says this time, the Gemara says indeed, we can conclude that. And the Gemara just notes loken, so it says over here that if they're contradicted in terms of whether there was a murder, so then they get malchus for being false witnesses. Why should they get malchus? Treyu treininu. Isn't it a situation of two witnesses against two witnesses? How do we know they're the liars? Maybe the second witnesses are the liars. My chazis to smach dahani smachani. Who says rely on these witnesses? Maybe you should rely on those witnesses. And the Gemara says to that, Amar Abaya says, Bebo horog baraglav. We're talking about a case where again the first witnesses come in and say Reuven killed Shimon, and then they're not simply contradicted, but Shimon actually walks in. The person who was supposed to be killed actually walks into court, walks in with his feet, so to speak, and therefore it is obvious that those witnesses are liars, and that's why they get malchus. And Rashi explains, Lokin Mishum Losan, again they get malchus because they're false witnesses. V'afagav delav shein bo maisu. Now even though this is a negative commandment which doesn't have an action, it's just testimony, it's just words, hamaisu behedi Meseches makos, but it's brought explicitly in Meseches makos, the malchus be'edim zomen ksiv, that malchus is written by edim zomen, mivitztiku es hatzadik v'gomer. And again the Gemara said, V'sal gadaytachol l'Rebbe Elazar, who's mu'achar ekein ne'erog. And if you think according to Rebbe Elazar that if there's a later falsification they get killed, kilohu is ma'amai lokin. So if they're not falsified, why do they get malchus? Havali lav shenitin lazharas. Again, it's a lav shenitin lazharas misas bezin shelo yasa kach shelo yimisu bezin, meaning they shouldn't do such and such, otherwise bezin might kill them. And the rule is ve'ein lokin olav. The rule is you don't generally get malchus the misas bezin who own shoshalab, because it's the misas bezin which is the punishment for that lav. And the Gemara said, my chazas to samachto. Why do you rely on the second witnesses and not the first? B'shlama hazama chidish gezeres kasavu. I understand if there's hazama, they say imanu ha'yisam, you were with us. That's a chidish of the Torah. It's a hakasav. We believe the second witness is over the first. Aval hachasha, but when it comes to contradictory witnesses, lav chidish kishatisra gufa shaleidas hu dekasvei rachmana. That's not part of that chidish. It's only when the gufa shaleidas is contradicted by imanu ha'yisam, then we say that we believe the second set of witnesses. But otherwise, we don't believe the second set of witnesses. And so finally, the Gemara said, Beba harag baraglav. We're talking about when the murdered individual actually walks into bezin. Oso sha'amar olav shunerag, the person that they were saying was killed, bachai baraglav lefanenu, who walks in with his feet in front of us, and therefore it is obvious that they are false witnesses. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Gonav al pishnaim, if somebody steals by two witnesses testify that he stole. V'tavachu machar al pi eid echad, but then there's only one witness that says that he slaughtered or sold the animal. O al pi atzmo, or he admits that he slaughtered or sold the animal. Meshalim tashlumei kefil, so then he'll pay the double payment for stealing. Ve'enu meshalim tashlumei daled vehe, but he will not pay the 4 or 5 times the amount. Gonav v'tavach b'Shabbos, let's say they testify that he stole and slaughtered on Shabbos. Gonav v'tavach la'avodah zarah, he slaughtered and then he stole and then slaughtered it to avodah zarah. Gonav mishal aviv, if he stole from his father, v'meis aviv, and then his father died, v'yachar kach tavach umachar, and then he slaughtered or sold it. The idea is that he really has ownership at that point in time of the slaughtering or the selling. Gonav v'hikdish, if he steals it and makes it hektish, v'yachar kach tavach umachar, and then he slaughters or sells it. Mishalim tashlumei kefil, so then he pays the double payment in all of these cases. Ve'enu mishalim tashlumei daled vehe, but he does not pay the 4 or 5 times the amount. And the Mishnah continues, Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon says, Kachim shechai b'achar yusum, if we're talking about kachim, an animal that's designated as a carbon and the owner is responsible, let's say something happens to that animal, he's going to have to bring a different animal, he's chai b'achrayus, so then, Mishalim tashlumei daled vehe, then there is a payment of 4 or 5 times the amount. However, she'ein chai b'achar yusum, but if it's kachim, that the owner is not responsible to replace it if something should happen, so pater, then he's going to be exempt from daled vehe. And Rashi explains, Meshalim tashlumei kefil, again, if there are edim that he stole, so then he has to pay kefil, d'ha'ika sahadi ha'gneva, because there are witnesses on the gneva, on the stealing. Ve'eno meshalim daled vehe, but he doesn't have to pay the 4 or 5 times the amount if there's just one witness on the tvich or mechira, or he admits on the tvich and mechira. Al hodas atzmo de moda b'knas pater, you don't pay on admission, because moda b'knas, when you admit by a fine, the person is pater. And then the Mishnah said, V'gana v'tavach b'Shabbos, if he steals and then he slaughters on Shabbos, pater atvicha, he's pater for paying for the slaughtering, the havim is chayav b'nafsho, because he's already chayav misa. We say, kamle b'deravamine, he gets the stricter punishment of the chayav misa, he's not going to have to pay. V'meis aviv, if his father dies, v'hu yarshu, and he inherits his father, and then he does the tvicha, then he slaughters, so v'lo have a tvicha kula b'isur, so the slaughtering is not entirely forbidden, it's not entirely in isur, because he owns part of that animal. And gana v'hikdash, if he steals it and he makes makes it hektish. Ki kotavach de hektish tavach v'lo de bailam. So then it's considered he's slaughtering hektish's property and not the owner's. And Rabbi Shimon Omer, finally, Rabbi Shimon makes a distinction between kachim shechayev b'achriyusam and kachim she'ein chayev b'achriyusam. The Gemara mefarish haya. The Gemara will explain exactly what Rabbi Shimon is going on. And the Gemara says, Al pi eid echad, it says that if there's just one witness on the tvicha, so pshita, so isn't that obvious that you're not going to pay? Why does the Mishnah even need to say that? And Rashi explains, Al pi eid echad pshita, b'shlam al pi atzma. I understand the case in the Mishnah where he admits to the tvicha. Itzrich lashminan demoda b'knas pater. That's already teaching us the idea that if a person admits by a fine, he's pater. Al pi eid echad lamali, but the fact there's one witness and you don't have to pay, that's obvious. Why do we even need to say it? And the Gemara says, Amri, they answer as follows, Hakamash malon, al pi atzmo dumya dal pi eid echad. What it's teaching us is that al pi atzmo, if he admits, it's similar to the case of eid echad. Ma'al pi eid echad, just like when you have one witness, ki asi eid echad mitztarif b'hadei mechayev. If another aid would come, he would join that first witness, and the person actually would be chayev. Al pi atzmo nami, so too if it's through himself, if he admits, ki asu eidim mechayev. But if eidim do come, he will have to pay. Le'afukim mid Rav Huna Marav, and that comes to exclude what Rav Huna said that Rav said. Yamar Rav Huna Marav, because Rav Huna said that Rav said moed b'knas v'yachar kach bo eidim potter, that if somebody admits by a fine and then eidim come, the person is potter because he admitted. But we seem to be saying in our Mishnah that is not the case. If the person admits, he's potter, but if eidim subsequently come, then he will have to pay. And the Gemara continues, Gufa, returning to what we just said above. Amar Rav Huna says, Amar Rav, that Rav says, Mod b'knas v'yachar kach bo eidim potter. If a person admits by a knas and then eidim come, he is potter. And Rashi explains, Ki osi eid echad mitzdarif, if a second aid would come, then he would join the first aid. The halacha Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha, because the halacha is like Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha. The Amar, because Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha says, Sanhedrin shomin devarav shel zeh hayom, v'chashiyav chaver l'machar. Shomin as devarav, the Sanhedrin can hear the testimony of one person today, and then when his friend comes tomorrow, they can hear that testimony, and they can join that together. Ki asu eidim mechayev, so too our Mishnah is saying that if eidim would come after the hodah, he would be chayev. V'chiyamrina de moda b'knas pater, when we say moda b'knas pater, heichad that's if Edom don't come subsequently by admitting he's not mechayev himself in a knas. But if Edom comes subsequently, he would be chayev. And the Gemara continues at the two dots, Kufa, returning to what we said above. Amar Rav Huna Marav, Rav Huna said that Rav said, Moda v'knas v'yachar kach bo Edom potter. If somebody admits by a fine and then Edom come, the person is still potter. Eisvei Rav Chisda Rav Huna. Rav Chisda asked Rav Huna the following question. The Brisa says, Ma'aseh Rabbi Gamliel shasimas ein tavi avdo. There was an incident with Rabbi Gamliel where he blinded the eye of his slave Tavi. Vayasameach simcha gedola. Rabbi Gamliel was very happy. As Rashi explains, Vayasameach lefi she'eved kasher haya, because Tavi was a good eved. Vayamesavel l'shachro, and he wanted to free him. Rabbi Gamliel wanted to free him. Elasham shachra avdo over b'aseh. It's just that if somebody frees his eved, he transgresses a positive commandment, and so he was very happy that through blinding Tavi ended up going free. So Matzal Rabbi Yeshua, so Rabbi Gamliel found Rabbi Yeshua. Amar lo, he said to him, Iyata yodea shetavi avdi yatzel l'cheiros. Don't you know that my slave Tavi, he went free? Amar lo, he said back to him, Lama, why? Amar lo, he said back, Shasimisias eina, because I blinded him. Amar lo, he said back to him, Ein b'dvarcha klum, what you're saying is nothing. Shekvar ein lo edim, because there are no witnesses, and therefore, since there are no witnesses, this is a situation of a knas. In a situation of a knas, if a person is moda by a knas, he's potter, and therefore, Tavi does not go free. And so the Gemara says the implication is hayesh lo edem chayiv. The implication is that if there would be witnesses, then he would be chayiv. He would set him free, even though it's moda b'knas v'yachar kach bo edem. V'shamina minasa. Don't we see from here moda b'knas v'yachar kach bo edem chayiv, that if somebody admits by a knas and then edem come chayiv, and that goes against what Rav said. So Amar Lei, so he said back to him, meaning Rav Huna responded to this question, Shani Rabbi Gamliel, it's different by Rabbi Gamliel, the lo b'fnei Bezdin odi, because he didn't actually admit in front of Bezdin, so it's not actually a classic case of moda b'knas v'yachar kach bo edem. But the Gemara says, Rabbi Yoshua av Bezdin have it. But Rabbi Yoshua was the av Bezdin, so he is admitting in front of Bezdin. And Rashi explains, Shekvar ein loch edem, because there are no witnesses, v'al pi atzmecho lo teshalem knas, you're not going to have to pay a fine by your own admission. Hayesh lo edem, but it implies, meaning the Bryce implies, that if there would be witnesses, v'yasu basar hoda, even if they come after the admission, chayev, it sounds like chayev. Again, that's a question on Rav. And again, the Gemara answered that Rabbi Gamliel did not admit in front of Bezdin. We will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Ayin Hey Amud Aleph.